Chapter 2, Section 2, American Independence. Today we're going to look at the events that led up to the American Revolution, and we start first with the French and Indian War, often called the 7 Years' War, which is a misnomer because the war actually was fought over 9 years. The French and Indian War was the first time that the colonies united against a common enemy. Now, we won't discuss much of the war at all, but what we will say is this. The French and Indian War was the first time that the colonies actually united as one to fight against a common enemy. Now, when you hear French and Indian War, you think it's the French versus the Indians, but that's not the case. It's the French and the Indians against the British. And many of the colonists elected to join the war effort, believing that they had a lot at stake. They didn't necessarily consider themselves British soldiers. And those British soldiers that were here, they were to be housed and fed by the colonists who lived here. And that, of course, leads us to the Third Amendment in our United States Constitution, which is known as the Quartering Act. And we'll talk more about that next month. With the end of the French and Indian War and Great Britain's claim to Canada and, of course, the Ohio River Valley, it was a time that Great Britain decided to enact taxes that would, of course, pay for the French and Indian War. And one of the things that they did was to tax sugar. Now, you may think that placing a tax on sugar would be kind of harsh, but in reality, the tax was actually a rewrite of an earlier tax that made it even cheaper to purchase the sugar. The issue, though, was that much of the sugar that was brought into the country was done so by smugglers. And of course, the colonists were very angered that the British would enforce these rules, and they actually went so far as to place tax collectors at the ports so that the colonists were forced to pay those taxes. And of course, that tax would then be offset um, in the goods that we purchased. The effect was that the colonists were urged to boycott or refuse to buy British goods. Now, the Stamp Act required a government tax on paper goods and all legal documents, including contracts and licenses. Newspapers, almanacs, and even printed sermons and playing cards had to bear the official stamp. These taxes infuriated the colonists, and they resorted to organizing protests throughout the colonies. And one of the colonial societies that called for protests was named the Sons of Liberty. And their goal was to intimidate the stamp agents who were charged with collecting the tax for Parliament. And a lot of these so called protesters or mobs went so far as to hang effigies or likenesses of the tax collectors by trees, and even they would behead them, and some would be tarred and feathered. And of course, if you put boiling tar on someone and feather them, their skin can't breathe. And the next event that took us toward independence was the Boston Massacre in 1770. And again, here we have a colonial mob or protesters who were harassing British soldiers and throwing rocks at them, throwing snowballs at them, hitting them. And quite frankly, the soldiers who were gathered there, they were pretty calm during this whole situation until somebody fired a shot. Now, the rumor is that they're not sure who fired the shot, but the British did return fire without their commander's authorization. And this, of course, led to three people being killed, eight people being wounded. And of course, one of those people killed was a man by the name of Crispus Attucks, who was a black man in Boston at the time. Well, this unruliness led to the British retreating from Boston, almost in a sense of saying, "Okay, we understand. We're going to back off." John Adams, who would become our second president, actually defended these soldiers at trial during this time, and only two were convicted. And what further sparked revolutionary ideals was the Boston Tea Party in 1773. You've learned about the Boston Tea Party before, but the outcome of this is that the colonists were angered over having to pay for a tea and being consigned to one group to purchase that tea from. And so these Sons of Liberties and other mobsters dressed up as Native Americans, and they ended up dumping 342 of 2,000 chests of tea into the harbor. And many of those participants who were there that night, who dressed up as Native Americans, were actually smugglers who were losing money based on the taxes and infringements that were placed at these harbors. So Samuel Adams, who was the founder and leader of the Sons of Liberty, argued that it was not a mob but a legal protest. And I want you to think about that because a lot of people are using those same areas of interest and topics today to validate the protesting going on in the United States today. You can imagine how King George III felt when he learned of the Boston Tea Party. It enraged him. So he in Parliament further called on harsher penalties against the colonies. He stripped them of their self government and rule, and he closed Boston for a while. He also made it known that soldiers would, from this point forward, be housed in colonial homes, and of course, the people who housed them had to feed them as well. They would have to do their laundry, etc., and there was nothing that they could do about this. Thousands of British troops were dispatched to the colonies to enforce this measure. This, of course, had the effect in the colonies of creating the First Continental Congress, which meant to say, listen, all British goods were now going to be boycotted. We need to become self sufficient, start making our own goods here in the United States. Well, what would become the United States? And it demanded an end to British military occupation as well as the right to impose their own tax laws, which, again, if I to repeat myself, the British tax laws were harsher on British citizens than they were on colonists here in the United States. British, of course, rebuked the demands of the First Continental Congress, and what they ended up doing then was clashing with militia in Lexington and Concord, which was the start of the American Revolution in 1775. And of course, those first shots became known as the shots heard round the world. The first attempt at unifying the different colonies in America came with the New England Confederation in 1643. Remember, Jamestown was founded in 1607. So by this time, we are now colonizing much of the coast of the Atlantic coast in America here. And the purpose of the New England Confederation was to defend against the threats from Native Americans as well as the Dutch who also lived here. And the unification lasted until 1684. And no one really thought about unification again until the outbreak of the French and Indian War. When the French and Indian War broke out, the uh, British government and Parliament they suggested to the colonies to create an alliance with the Native Americans that made up the Iroquois Confederation. And as you see here, they were made up from the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, the Seneca, and the Tuscaroras. And the purpose was so that the British would be fighting one group and not two groups. It's widely believed that by the start of the French and Indian War, the Iroquois Confederation had been around since the 1500s, almost 200 years at that point. So enter Benjamin Franklin, who in 1754 tried to gain the support of the Iroquois by calling an alliance with them in Albany, New York. And this became known as the Albany Plan of the Union. And what it did was it called for a council of representatives that were appointed by colonial assemblies and a president general appointed by the king. So what you would have is colonial input as well as the British input. And the proposed council would have the power to control trade, raise armies, build settlements, and equip fleets while maintaining a relationship with the Iroquois Indians or the confederation that the Iroquois belonged to. Although the delegates in the Albany unanimously approved the plan, the colonial assemblies were quick to reject it. They feared that the plan gave too much power to the crown. Likewise, the British were uneasy at the prospect of uniting the colonies, and so they as well rejected the plan. However, 22 years later, this plan would be the basis of our Constitution. We had already mentioned the First Continental Congress. Well, 3 weeks after the militia and British skirmished in Lexington and Concord, the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia. And 12 of 13 colonies attended this. Many delegates no longer expected better treatment by the crown. Instead, they were resolved to take stronger measures. And one of the Congress's first action was to organize the militia around Boston into the actual Continental Army that would be used to fight the Revolutionary War. And they unanimously chose George Washington as its commander. If you remember, George was a fighter during the French and Indian War. He had been trained in British military tactics, and quite frankly, he was not a good soldier, but he was an amazing leader, and that's what was important to the Congress. Before the Continental Congress decided to break away altogether, they did send King George III a final appeal. This final appeal was known as the Olive Branch Petition, which, of course, was one last ditch effort by the colonists to ask Parliament to repeal all those measures that were placed on the colonies. And of course, King George III refused to even read this petition, and he looked at it as a rebellion, and he wanted the traitors to be brought to justice. That meant that every single man who signed his name to any of the documents, including the Olive Branch Petition, to be deemed traitors, and they were to be hanged whenever they were captured. They were enemies of the state. Things could have possibly calmed down, but in January of 1776, an Englishman by the name of Thomas Paine wrote a 47-page political pamphlet that would inspire widespread support for independence. His document, called Common Sense, was a mixture of political rhetoric which divided government away from the crown, which of course was a monarchy, and he placed all the blame for all the problems of colonial hostilities directly at Parliament, who issued all of these proclamations towards the colonies. Paine connected independence with common dissenting Protestant beliefs as a means to present a distinctly American political identity, and structured Common Sense as if it were a sermon. To this day, in 2020, Thomas Paine's book is the most widely published book in the United States. That's saying something for a book that was published first in 1776. Now, the Declaration of Independence, which was authored by five different men and handwritten by Thomas Jefferson, was likely inspired by John Locke's view on social contract theory, as well as the Virginia Declaration of Rights. And the Declaration of Rights was written by George Mason, who was a Virginian, and he proclaimed that all men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights. Of course, Jefferson then takes that further and expands in the Declaration of Independence that man has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is a change from earlier in the notes, in which we said originally, not in the Declaration, but originally, that man was entitled to liberty, or excuse me, life, liberty, and property. So property was now changed to the pursuit of happiness. The importance of the Virginia Declaration of Rights is that it is the basis and foundation of our government. It's also influenced in the Bill of Rights, which was added to the Constitution. A constitution is a written plan of government. And by 1780, each state had their own constitution. Now remember, for us to win the Revolutionary War, we needed the assistance of a foreign country. Of course, that foreign country was France, who, of course, we fought in the French and Indian War. And France would only give us help if we had our own constitution or government, which, of course, would lead us to the Articles of Confederation, which was the very first form of government or the first constitution used by the United States of America. Now, Pennsylvania's first constitution was established in 1776. It's described as the most democratic in America, although it notably based rights in men and not in persons, as the other contemporaneous constitutions did in neighboring states. Now, some of the things that the Pennsylvania Constitution had was first, it had voting franchises for all men who paid taxes, and of course, this was less restrictive than other states. It had a unicameral legislature, not unicameral, in which members were elected for one term. It had a 12-member Supreme Executive Council that administered the government in Pennsylvania. The judiciary was appointed by the legislature for 7-year terms, and of course, there was a provision that all approved legislation would take effect only after the next session, which meant that they would propose something, and then, of course, that would give people a year to talk about it before it was put into effect. So let's take all these state constitutions, and what that's going to do is, of course, it's going to make all the people in charge despise the central government. And we're going to see this under the Articles of Confederation when the central government had very limited powers. And when we talk about limited government, we're going to now separate the powers into legislative, executive, and judicial. And of course, legislative is first, Article 1, executive is second, Article 2, and judicial is third, Article 3. And it will imply term limits to everyone but our judicial system. And when I say judicial system, I'm referring to the Supreme Court. All others have term limits, except for federal judges do not. There were voting laws, and of course, the state constitutions met in order to um, parlay any and all government action. And that will be a wrap for Chapter 2, Section 2. We'll have a quiz tomorrow on this information, so make sure that you are ready and have your notes with you.